Hello and welcome to Lucas in Scotland, where in a few hours from now one of the last major events in the British Airshow season gets underway. The French national display team, the Patrie de France, are here, along with the Silver Swallows from Ireland and many regulars from nearer home. But before we see them, there's a whole lot more to come.
Yes, over the last 4 months we've been travelling up and down the country, sampling the best of the flying display action. And in this 3-hour video, you can share it with us. In the year that marked the 50th anniversary of the United States Air Force, we'll be going to Mildenhall to see the USAF Thunderbirds and their dramatic F-16 fighters.
Also from America, the extraordinary B-2 stealth bomber making its first public landing in Britain. That was at Fairford, where we'll also see the Ukrainian Falcons, another UK first.
We'll have the amazing Flying Legend show from Duxford with no less than 3 Hurricanes in the air together, plus a rare Mustang new to this country.
We'll be going to Paris to check out the showcase event for the world's aerospace industry. We'll also be looking at flying as it used to be, biplanes and picnics in the grounds of Woburn Abbey.
But first we go to North Weald in Essex, which by tradition is the first major show of the season. This year it was dogged by rain and strong winds, and a lot of people stayed away. But if the weather wasn't great, the flying more than made up for it. North Weald has a lot going for it as an airshow venue. For a start, the name alone evokes the memory of the Battle of Britain, when Spitfires and Hurricanes were stationed here and daily launched into the sky to repel the Luftwaffe. And then it's well placed, just outside London's M25 ring and next to the M11. But, set against that, the weather in May is a touch unreliable, and even if it does improve later, a bad forecast can well scare the punters away. Flying displays do take place in the rain, but the pilots often can't do their full shows.
Ladies and gents, good morning.
And weather's not the only problem they have to contend with. There are obstacles on the ground as well, and a local farmer has already complained about aeroplanes over his farm the day before the show actually starts.
Where possible, common sense, where possible, please, 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 if you can, avoid that farm. We will come back to it, but yesterday we had a lawyer's deposition in here, right, with all sorts of wonderful threats of coming in with court orders to ban this air show, which would have been a little bit embarrassing this morning. Okay? I am happy that nobody yesterday deliberately did anything they shouldn't do. The farmer says, all your military guys particularly, you're all targeting my farm. All right? But it's a fact of life that the farm is under the 230-metre line.
Now, it's not called fighter meet for nothing. Fighters came on the scene in the First World War. Aeroplanes like this beautifully built replica of the Royal Aircraft Factory's SE-5A. SE stood for Scout Experimental, but these became anything but experimental. They were amongst the best of the First War fighters. This is the other aeroplane of a pair built by the pilots and owners and their families. In fact, the pilots are almost as old as the original aeroplanes. Doug Gregory is 74 and Des Biggs is a mere stripling of 64. And of course, one of their classic adversaries was the Fokker triplane, and this replica belongs to the Museum of Army Flying. It's flown by Major Nick O'Brien of the School of Army Aviation at Middle Wallop. Not the famous triplane of the Red Baron von Richthofen, but representing the aeroplane of his contemporary, Lieutenant Josef Karl Jacobs, who was the highest scoring pilot on German triplanes. He wanted a contrast with Richthofen's red aeroplane, hence the black colour scheme. And here are all three together in post-war friendship. But the strong winds of the show weekend eventually proved a bit too much for the triplane, which is particularly sensitive to crosswinds. Nick O'Brien gets it down okay, but then the damage was slight, but it was enough to stop it flying the next day. In fact, even the powerful World War II fighter the Mustang rocks in the crosswind on takeoff. That propeller's more than 11 feet in diameter, by the way, and it's driven by the 1,500 horsepower of the American Packard version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and that's the one that powered the Hurricanes and early Spitfires. And if this aircraft looks much more squat, that's because, unlike the Merlin's inline, slim shape, this Bearcat has a big Pratt & Whitney 18-cylinder radial engine. But despite its rather unlikely shape, it was actually one of the fastest and most manoeuvrable piston engine fighters ever built. It was designed by Grumman in the US to combat the Japanese kamikaze fighters, and it just made it into service for the last few months of World War II. And these are the markings of the US Navy Squadron VF-41. This Corsair was also a naval fighter, but about 2 years earlier than the Bearcat, same engine as the Bearcat, but quite a bit heavier. Designed by Igor Sikorsky, that's the helicopter man, and it was designed to counter the Japanese Zero fighter. It was distinguished by its cranked wing shape, a bit like the German Stuka dive bomber, but unlike the Stuka, it could retract its undercarriage. This one is the only surviving flying example that served with the Royal New Zealand Air Force, and these are New Zealand markings. And going back to the US entry into the Pacific War, the Avenger is a bird of quite a different feather. It was a torpedo bomber, not a fighter, and its manoeuvrability, or rather its lack of it, is in some contrast to the Corsair and the Bearcat. However, it did have a rearwards-facing Stinger gun, and on one occasion that downed a Japanese fighter ace who attacked what he thought was a fighter without a rear gun. And here a typical delightful fighter meets small formation, Avenger, Bearcat and Corsair. One of the problems at North Weald is that it's under the controlled airspace of the various London airports, and pilots can't always get clearance to do their full displays. The controllers do try and get the necessary clearances before takeoff, but sometimes they only come through after the aircraft has got airborne.
Sometimes you won't even know, in fact, whether you have your altitude clearance until you're actually airborne. So you have three displays in mind. You have a flat show, a rolling show, and then a high show for really good weather. Or the full show as we call it. And it happened to me in the past. We've actually taken off, we're airborne, we're turning in for the first manoeuvre on the show, and we still don't know which display we're flying, which gives you a bit of a mental problem because you're trying to lock into gear for the right show. And then suddenly, of course, it will come through and they'll say, full show, rolling show, whatever, give us an altitude clearance. And then we have to say, right, okay, mindset onto that show, and away we go. So it can be quite exciting.
As well as being a pilot, Tom's also the boss of the Transair pilot shop, so he's the sponsor of the team.
From a cloud-based point of view, we won't be able to do the full show. It's highly unlikely at the moment, but having said that, we can still put on a show, sort of, as long as we get at least 1,500 feet, then we can do a rolling show, which, okay, it's not as dramatic, but it's still good fun, and it's good entertainment for the crowd, I think.
In fact, this little jet-powered team is just the first of several civilian jet outfits at Fighter Meet. They wouldn't be around at all without sponsorship, so for the airshow enthusiast, people like Tom Maloney are an important part of the airshow scene. Their jet provosts are ex-RAF aircraft. Until 1994, they were part of the Air Force's basic training fleet. That job is now done by the turboprop Tucano. And even if their weather-limited flat display is not the most exciting thing you've ever seen, they're worth having for their sheer attention to detail and the elegance of their turnout. And these gorgeous little Folland Gnats were the RAF's advanced trainers from the late 1950s. Bob Thompson was also the other half of the Transair Jet Provost team we saw just now.
We did the first show for a bit of fun last year at Duxford, and it was so well received. In fact, we were quite surprised. We actually got a complete round of applause at the end of it, and it was decided it would be a very good idea to try and emulate it again this year. But of course, the big problem is getting the pilots together, the aeroplanes together, and of course the show organisers to agree to actually do the display. This one here belongs to David Gilmour of the Pink Floyd. And I approached David some years ago to rebuild this aeroplane and to fly it, and we've been flying it for about 5 years on the display circuit. So it's quite a well-known and familiar aeroplane on the display circuit.
And the two other Nats belong to another vintage jet group, Kennet Aviation. This red one is in the colours of the 1967 Red Arrows, because the Nat was the team's first aircraft. And in case you're thinking, where's the white stripe they used to have? Well, they didn't think of that till the following year. The yellow represents the Yellow Jacks, who are the immediate precursors of the Red Arrows as the RAF's display team. And the silver Nat is in the colours of the third prototype aircraft from Follens, and indeed the usual colour scheme for the advanced training role. Aren't they just lovely? And now it's the big boys. Fighter Meets Vintage Jet Fest continues with the hunters of jet heritage. This is a real fighter. Those holes at the front are for the 4 30mm Aden cannon. In front is the 2-seater fighter trainer version, the T Mark 7. And then the red F Mark IV. F is for fighter. But here's a rare treat for vintage jet aficionados: 2 hunters and 3 Nats in formation. Hunter was always a prime example of the pilot's dictum: if it looks right, it probably is. And the clean, graceful lines have undoubtedly been part of the pilot's love affair with this classic jet. And the other thing that distinguishes the Hunter is the unique sound of the Rolls-Royce Avon engine and that long jet pipe. Back now to the earliest days of the jet scene. Brian Henwood in the Armstrong-Whitworth Meteor NF-11, NF for night fighter, leads the heritage pair. The Meteor was the first jet aircraft to enter RAF service. And behind the Meteor on the runway, Dick Hadlow in the T-55 export trainer version of the de Havilland Vampire. More gun ports in the Vampire's nose, because this was another fighter trainer. Now these rare old aircraft don't often do much in the way of aerobatics, but sometimes you do see them upside down. So, will we see it today? Yes? No? Yes! So, why was the Vampire designed with this strange shape? Well, they wanted to keep the jet pipe short to prevent loss of efficiency, and also because the shorter it was, the better they could stop the fuselage overheating. And bear in mind that these aircraft had wooden-framed fuselages. The Meteor, of course, had short jet pipes anyway, because its 2 engines were in the wing. Now here's an even rarer, in fact unique, flying example of a historic aeroplane. And while we're on the superlatives, aren't these end-of-the-runway shots lovely? Anyway, this was the Royal Navy's first successful carrier-borne jet fighter and ground attack aircraft. It's the Hawker Siddeley Seahawk, newly restored into pristine flying condition for the 1997 season. She belongs to the Royal Navy's historic flight, and the restoration work was done by British Aerospace at Duxford. It's an interesting layout because she has only one engine, a Rolls-Royce Nene. There are two intakes at the front, nothing unusual about that, but the jet pipe also divides to come out on both sides of the aircraft. They call that bifurcated. Once again, keeping things short and efficient. Sad to say, though, Seahawk suffered a problem with that bifurcated jet pipe, which has kept her from flying for the second half of the season. We hope that she may be back to grace some 1998 air shows. Staying with the maritime theme, although in this case an aircraft operated by the Air Force rather than the Navy, the consolidated Catalina, a great favourite with air show audiences. That crosswind catches her as she gets off the ground. And as those wheels retract in a slightly asymmetric fashion, you can see the strange things that having to land on water does to an aeroplane. There are those engines, and hence the wing, high up above the fuselage to keep them out of the spray. And there's that extraordinary boat-shaped underside, because of course this is a flying boat. In fact, it's an amphibian, land or water, it doesn't mind. And that means, of course, two sets of undercarriage, and here are the wingtip floats extended for the show. Although, of course, at landlocked North Weald, no chance of using them. Catalina, originally the RAF's name for the aircraft, but eventually adopted by the US Navy as well, was a patrol bomber and torpedo carrier. Cats were used for protecting convoys, for anti-submarine warfare, for reconnaissance, and of course for search and rescue. This beauty is the only one flying in Britain. She's operated by a company called Plain Sailing. Nice, that. Denny Dobson now in his much-sponsored Pitts Special aerobatic biplane, registration G. Bird. And after all that amazing virtuosity in the air, that crosswind is making it really hard for Denny to get the tiny, unstable and very lightweight Pitts firmly back on the ground. Perhaps it would be kinder not to dwell on his unease. But there's the evidence of the wind. Now here's a strange thing to do with an aeroplane. In fact, it's a pretty strange aeroplane. Not only that, but Tim Senior is going to take off from this position.
It's easier, in fact, than taking off from the ground. And one of the things is because the car accelerates it up to speed, you've actually gone through any crosswind problems, obviously bar a really bad crosswind. So it makes the takeoff a lot easier. I actually call the speeds out because obviously the car speed is different to mine. And I call it like 65, 70, and then whenever I say it's 70 miles an hour, he then holds the speed that he has. And I call ready, 3, 2, 1, now, and which he pulls the release, and you just squeeze back on the stick and off you go. 1, now.
And there he was gone, the Flying Shogun, or to give it its proper aeronautical name, the Cricri. It's named after its designer's daughter. He's Michel Colombon, she's Christine. But Cricri also means a cricket in French. The other end of the scale, the biggest single-engine biplane in the world, the utterly butterly Antonov AN-2. Oh no, the Cricri is not going to take him on, is it? In fact, as they get closer, you'll be able to see that the creakery wing is smaller than the big Ant's elevator, and that's the bit at the back of the tailplane that makes it go up and down. And from the same stable as those two, Vic Norman's Aero Superbatics in Gloucestershire, here are the famous Cadbury's Crunchy Flying Circus. Now, what's Mark Hanna doing talking to James Bond?
Now, I'll taxi first, then Rolf.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you come down.
My hair's not supposed to be seen blowing, guys, so I'll just do a quick plug for L'Oreal if you don't mind.
Well, what that's all about is that Mark Hanna and his L-39 Albatross jet are appearing in the title sequence of the newest James Bond film, Tomorrow Never Dies. They have a car-aeroplane duel with James Bond, alias Pierce Brosnan, alias for the driving sequences, stand-in Douglas James. And now you know as much about this sequence at Fighter Meet as we do.
James Bond has it coming to him. Oh no!
Since the end of the Cold War, training aircraft from the former Eastern Bloc countries are a much more common sight. But old habits of denigrating them as being built with big nuts and bolts and handling like tractors die hard.
I've flown Eastern European airplanes right from World War II types through to L-39s and MiG-15s and so on, and you cannot fault the handling on them. They're excellent airplanes, much rubbished by the West, particularly during the Cold War period, I suspect, of sort of propaganda thing. Sure, in a lot of cases, some of them are apparently crudely built, but it doesn't matter. They're functional and they do the job, and they have very, very high performance. And particularly the MiG-15, for example, which we're flying here today as well, you can see why it gave Sabres such a hard time during the Korean War, because it has a tremendous climb performance, tremendous top speed, excellent airplane, and everything's very simple and works well. This airplane is very reliable, very safe, always works, always starts, and if you look at it closely, it's definitely not crudely finished, it's beautifully finished. And you can buy one from the factory right now, brand new, for $1.5 million. And that's the difference between this kind of airplane and a Western airplane. Equivalent Western airplane would be millions of dollars.
On the Saturday, the weather did not even improve for the Red Arrows, who are often known for managing to make use of the most unlikely small patches of blue sky. So, for their first major show of the season, under the brand new leadership of Squadron Leader Simon Meade, they had to make do with their flat show, sometimes known as the Ratty Flatty. Perhaps I should say that the word flat refers to the fact that they can't do any vertical manoeuvres, and not, of course, to the entertainment value of the show. Coming up here, the split into two formations, the front one called Enid, after Enid Blyton's famous 5, and the back 4 generally referred to as Jippo, for no reason that anyone's prepared to talk about. They'll split the formation further when the two aircraft that make up the synchro pair leave to do their dramatic crossovers. Altogether, a good effort for a first show.
The Red Arrows closing fighter meet in 1997, and we'll be seeing them a little later here at Lucas. Well, some good displays, Sean, at North Weald, but I understand that the show wasn't altogether a success, at least financially.
Well, air shows are a gamble financially, and so few people came to the show because of the weather that some of the people who actually participated in it had to accept half their normal fee, which didn't go down very well. In fact, one or two people refused to do that. The result of that was that there were some suggestions that fighter meet might not take place next year.
It is, in fact, going ahead, though, I believe, is it?
We understand that there will be a fighter meet next year, which is a good thing.
Yes, I think they've now got sponsorship, and we wish them very well in 1998. Well, we now go up the M11 to Mildenhall, which is the home of the US Air Force in Britain. This year they were celebrating their 50th anniversary, and that made a natural theme for the Mildenhall Air Fete. This is one of the biggest shows of the year, and the Saturday crowd of 200,000 was a record. It's also a very distinctive show. No sponsored participants, all military aircraft, and almost all jets, except for the odd Mustang and Hercules. You know what you're going to get at Mildenhall. The American flavour is much in evidence, even down to the food. You can't get a sandwich here. They only sell hamburgers and fried chicken. On the history side, a replica of the Bell X-1, which first broke the sound barrier 50 years ago. Chuck Yeager achieved 700 miles an hour. This year, a car went even faster. The real anniversary celebrations involved the United States Air Force itself, marked here by a rare appearance from the Thunderbirds. We'll be seeing them a little later. But first, we're going to look at two other national teams, and we start with Italy's Frecce Tricolori. The Frecce are one of the world's great aerobatic teams, and there's something about these little Air Macchi 339s which seems to reflect the national character. They have the same sleek lines as the best-known Italian sports cars, Alfa Romeos perhaps. And another thing about the Frecce is that there are 10 of them. No other national team has so many aircraft. The Frecce take off in two groups of 5 and quickly form up into their standard formation, the arrow. Frecce, of course, means arrows. And as the smoke comes on, you can see what's meant by tricolori. Those are the 3 colours of the Italian flag. Now they're going to split into 2 groups, and meanwhile the solo pilot flies off by himself. Now here's the solo pilot again, and he does things that you just don't see with other jet trainers. Manoeuvres like this can really upset jet engines, which like to have a smooth flow of air, but it doesn't seem to bother the 339. And that's one of the reasons why the Frecce have one solo pilot instead of an opposition pair like the Red Arrows. It gives us a chance to see the aircraft at its best. As always, a really first-class display from the Frecce Tricolori. Another team now, and here are the Frecce's neighbours from across the Swiss border. The Patrice Swiss fly the Northrop F-5 Tiger, an old aircraft now but relatively new to them. Until 1995 they flew British Hunters. The F-5 is a very successful fighter, but it wasn't really built for aerobatic displays, and you can't throw them round the sky like a trainer. The aircraft is fast though, and that makes for spectacular crossovers with a closing speed of 1,000 miles an hour. This is not a full-time team. The pilots are brought together from different squadrons. This was their first display at Mildenhall, and a pretty good one. But then you'd expect precision flying from the Swiss. Well, now we come to the Americans, and here's an aircraft that for years no one was allowed to see. The F-117 stealth fighter was built in secret. In its early days, it flew only at night. Now out in the open, its crews often get asked an obvious question. Since the aircraft is designed to be invisible to radar, how do air traffic controllers manage to see it?
We try not to be stealthy when we're flying around under air traffic control because we don't want anyone else to run into us, so we have to let them know where we are. If you notice on the sides of the airplane, we actually have radar cross-section enhancers that enhances our radar return. They're just bolted onto the side, and we leave them on. In the event of wartime, we'll take them off.
Besides the static aircraft, the Americans brought one to display. Both had flown from Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. The extraordinary shape of the F-117 does not make for good flying characteristics, but that can be overcome by computers. The aircraft is a fly-by-wire machine.
A lot of the capabilities of the stealth aircraft are not similar to the turning and thrust capabilities of like the F-16, the F-15, or the Tornado. I have to commend the engineers who designed the thing because it is an extremely easy airplane to fly. As you can tell, it's not very aerodynamic, and they did an excellent job with the flight control system and the computers such that it handles just like a regular airplane or actually even almost a video game.
Making the 117 stealthy was a big challenge to its designers. Since radar signals are most easily reflected by vertical surfaces, this aircraft has none. In fact, no line is closer to the vertical than 30 degrees. To onlookers, the jet exhaust is a puzzle. In fact, it comes out of the narrow slits behind the wings. That cuts down the infrared heat emission. And the aircraft doesn't have reheat. That means it's quite slow for a fighter. It's about as fast, in fact, as an ordinary jet airliner. But since the F-117 is difficult to spot, it doesn't need to be fast. In the Gulf War, it was used against high-value targets and went almost undetected. In fact, the stealth fighter is not really a fighter at all, but a bomber. But though the 117 was one of the big draws at Mildenhall, the crowds had really come to see its big brother. The B-2 stealth bomber had flown all the way from the States to make just 2 escorted flypasts. It went home again without landing, but we'll be seeing it again at Fairford. On its way back across the Atlantic, the B-2 would be met by a KC-135 tanker like this. You can see its refueling boom extended. Mildenhall is the home of the 100th Air Refuelling Wing, which supports many NATO operations. And here's another of its aircraft, an MC-130. In this demonstration, the Hercules is joined by an MH-53 helicopter. But this aircraft doesn't need air-to-air refuelling. The Rockwell B-1B Lancer is an intercontinental bomber with a range of more than 7,000 miles. Those huge bomb bays carry up to 40 tons of conventional bombs and release them all in just over a second. Designed as a replacement for the B-52, this is the aircraft which would have delivered nuclear weapons deep into the heart of the Soviet Union. The B-1 has a crew of 4, and those panels above the cockpit indicate that it's fitted with ejector seats. Unusually for an aircraft of this size, the B-1 has variable geometry. You can see now the wing sweeping back into a delta. That reduces drag to enable supersonic flight. Its top speed is around 800 miles an hour. And for such a large aircraft, it's also pretty nimble. You can see here that the bone, as the pilots call it, can easily be rolled. In fact, you think they're going to, but they don't, not quite. And now the largest aircraft on display, the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy. The crews call it Fred, and that apparently means fantastic, ridiculous, financial disaster. In fact, the Galaxy isn't a bad aircraft, but with only 80 orders from the US government, the makers needed to sell a civil version to make it viable. The Galaxy, however, could not compete with the Boeing 747. The early aircraft also had major structural problems, which were later fixed. Of course, there's plenty more to see at Mildenhall than the flying displays. The static park is huge, with more than 200 aircraft to view at close range. And most of them have a crew on hand to answer questions. Some types are seldom seen in Britain, like this EA-6B Prowler. It had flown in from its base in Italy. That's where it operates electronic surveillance flights over Bosnia.
Its job is to go in and act as a suppression for surface-to-air missile systems for any kind of strike group that's going in. So we'll go in with receivers to identify the threat that's out there, and we've got jamming pods that put out a large amount of microwave energy as well as high-speed anti-radiation missiles to counter the threat.
Now, you're over in Europe to take part in the Bosnian action. How's that been working out for you?
It's been going very well. This is actually the second time we're here, so my crews were 80% experienced in the theater. We fly missions continually during the day and at night, just monitoring the situation, making sure their SAMs are in the cantonment sites, as well as they're now being allowed to radiate a little bit, and we're cataloging, if you will, their parameters for future action if it's required.
The Prowler has a huge array of weapons and electronic gadgetry. It carries the AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missile, or HARM, which locks onto radar installations and takes them out. Beneath the other wing, there's a jamming pod which disables target tracking radars. The device on the tail is simply known as the Big Football. That's full of receivers. And the aircraft emits so much radiation that the canopy has to be screened with gold plating to protect the crew. With so much hanging in the breeze, it's not very clean. That means it's not very fast and needs protection.
It's got a top speed of about 590 knots. It has no afterburners, and its roll rate compared to a fighter aircraft is relatively slow. Our job is primarily EC, electronic combat, so we go out with normally 2 F-18s provide us air-to-air protection when we go out into any kind of battlefield.
And one last thing about the Prowler, its moondog motif refers to an initiation ceremony which all new pilots have to undergo. The moondog cocktail is made from 2 shots of wild turkey and 1 shot of cherry brandy. After that, you have to eat a dog biscuit, and I dare say you don't go flying straight afterwards. Well, considering the show was to mark 50 years of the United States Air Force, the historic element was disappointing. It would have been nice to see a cavalcade of American warbirds. Many are preserved in Britain, and they do the rounds of the air show circuit. But, as I mentioned before, this show is really about jets, and the days of the piston were largely forgotten. However, this trio did do a short display on Sunday only. A P-63 King Cobra, a P-51 Mustang, and the lovely Flying Fortress Sally B, which is probably the best known historic aircraft in the country. We'll be seeing her again, plus a lot more warbirds when we visit Duxford. For the moment though, let's just enjoy the all too brief sound of these rare and important US types, which gave us a brief respite from the roar of jets. Back now to the present in 2 solo displays by the F-16 Fighting Falcon. This one is from the Belgian Air Force. The F-16 fighter bomber is one of the most successful US combat aircraft of all time. The RAF would have liked it, but got the Tornado instead. However, there are plenty in Europe. Belgium is one of 4 NATO countries which ordered the F-16 under co-production contracts. The aircraft seen here is an F-16A. And here's another F-16A, this one from the Royal Netherlands Air Force. And what a lovely and unusual colour scheme. The aircraft is inherently unstable, but from a pilot's point of view that doesn't matter. His control inputs are fed through computers. And in fact it's the aircraft's instability which makes it so manoeuvrable. But these are the F-16s which all the fuss was about. They're the aircraft of the Thunderbirds, the United States Air Force aerobatic team. This was their first appearance at Mildenhall since 1984, and though they've done European tours before, this was their first overseas deployment for a single show.
This time we left our home base in Las Vegas, Nevada, and we did a show at Andrews Air Force Base, Maryland, which is near D.C. And traveling over here, the support folks all went in a C-5 Galaxy, traveled over, and then the actual F-16 aircraft, all 8 of them, actually traveled with air refueling, doing 7 air refuelings en route, and came down here to England, and we're ready to do a show.
It must be quite something refueling all 8 aircraft on a transatlantic run like that.
Well, I'll tell you, the folks, they're all professionals and they're all great flyers, and it's just another walk in the park and a day flying a jet. So although it may be a little bit of a logistical challenge fuel-wise, they do a great job and they bring them back down every time. They can project just about anywhere. We are very excited to be here this year. We have not had the opportunity as much in the past. It's been since 1984 that we had the opportunity to be here at Mildenhall for the Air Fete. although last year we did do a European tour, which was a lot of fun, seeing a lot of Eastern Bloc countries we hadn't had the opportunity for. But all I can say is we're just ecstatic to be here, and it's great to be in England to do a show.
The Thunderbirds have been going since 1953 and do about 80 shows a year. For most of the time, the team of 6 is split into a 4-ship formation plus 2 solos. Here the solos are flying together in a mirror pass with no vertical separation at all. And though they're not quite as close as they look, that's pretty impressive. And here's a hesitation roll from one of the solos. Of course, this is done at higher speeds than the jet trainers we're more used to seeing. But the main group doesn't do anything particularly clever. There are changes in formation, but that's not very exciting with only 4 aircraft. You wonder why they only use white smoke. The American flag has red and blue as well. But, coming as they do from the most powerful military nation on Earth, it's easy to find fault. In fact, the Thunderbirds are a very skilled and highly professional team, and you certainly couldn't criticize their flying ability. A little conservative perhaps, but let's hope they don't leave it another 13 years before they come back.
The Thunderbirds marking the 50th anniversary of the United States Air Force. Now, the United States as a nation is known for its showmanship, so you might expect that their national team would put on an absolutely scintillating display. But there are many people in this country who think that it's, well, a bit disappointing. What did you think of it, Graham?
Well, I think one of the most disappointing things for me actually was that they only flew on one day. It is enormously expensive to bring a team like the Thunderbirds over from the States. They have to refuel them at least twice across the Atlantic. They came to Mildenhall, they flew for 20 minutes on the Saturday, and then the first thing on the Sunday morning they flew straight back to America, where I think they were going to do a show at the Air Force Academy. But as far as the display team themselves go, I think it is true to say that they're just not as interesting as the major European teams like the Frecce Tricolori and the Red Arrows. But there is one thing I like about them, and that's that they do fly very, very close. I don't think I've ever seen a display team that fly in such tight formation as the Thunderbirds. So that they do have their compensations.
And the other good thing about them is that they're flying very sharp frontline fighters, whereas most of the other teams are flying training aircraft.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Now, our next event is not a British show, but it does have plenty of British participation. It's the Paris Air Show, and it happens every 2 years. It alternates with our own Farnborough. Now, it's a trade show for the aerospace industry, and that means that it doesn't have a particularly big flying display, but it does draw a very big audience. In terms of money spent and orders taken, the Paris Air Show is the biggest trade fair in the world, although Farnborough's not far behind. They are slightly different. The British event emphasises the defence industry, the French go more for civil aviation, although of course many companies are involved in both. But this is where the aerospace giants come head-to-head in competition, and no expense is spared. Lockheed Martin of America is said to have spent $14 million on its exhibition here. But one of the fiercest rivalries is between the two airline giants, Boeing and Airbus Industry, and we start with the European plane makers. It's almost as if Airbus Industry wants to use the world's big air shows to point up the differences between it and Boeing. Boeing rarely, if ever, flies its aircraft at shows. Airbus regularly flies not one, but two. In this case, the two aircraft cover the whole span of Airbus production. From the biggest, the A340, 295-seater, wide-bodied, four-engined aircraft, to the smallest, the A319, 124-seater, single-aisle twin-jet. Anyway, we'll have more on the rivalry between the two companies in a moment. In this high nose-up attitude, you can clearly see the droops on the front of the wing and the flaps at the back. Both devices increase the curvature of the wing and make it produce more lift, so the aircraft can fly slowly and still generate enough lift to keep it airborne. Here the A319 flaps and droops are being retracted. Cleaning up is what the pilots call it, as the aircraft accelerates and its wings produce the same lift without the help of the so-called high-lift devices. Now it's the big one's turn. About 275 tons is what these things can weigh when they're fully loaded with fuel and payload, although I dare say it's nowhere near that today. But it's still an amazing sight to see something like this thrown around in almost fighter-like manoeuvres. To get an idea of the size, it's about 200-foot wingspan and 200 foot long. You could fit 2 baseball squares across it and 2 of them along. Another of those so-called high alpha or high angle of attack flypasts, demonstrating the Airbus fly-by-wire system. The pilot has the control stick fully back, and he then adjusts the engine so the aircraft neither climbs nor descends. The fly-by-wire computer system makes sure that it's done in complete safety. And incidentally, that control stick, well, it's just a little computer joystick on a side panel under the pilot's arm. And you can tell it's a heavy load-carrying aircraft from the fact that it has that extra set of wheels under the fuselage centerline. Now, the Airbus flying demonstrations were spectacular, but there was lots of interest on the stand in the exhibition hall. This is how Airbus sees the future. This will be the biggest airliner the world has ever seen. And the clue is in the 2 rows of windows down the side. It's a double-decker. And while that's a model, here's an idea of the real size. Échelle 1 means full scale. This is the cross-section, with the top deck, the main deck in the middle, and the lower deck for freight and baggage. One of the reasons for going this way is that Airbus reckons that its A3XX will be 15 to 20% cheaper to operate than today's big Boeing 747.
We'll be using the latest in technology, things like newer and lighter materials, such as carbon fiber. We'll be using the latest advances in aerodynamics. We'll be effecting savings in production technology. And of course, there's the scale effect. The fact that you've got one very large aircraft will give you a scale effect benefit.
Since Boeing cancelled its large aircraft project, the so-called Super Jumbo, Airbus finds itself well placed to fill what it sees as a worldwide need. But Boeing now says there is no need. So is Airbus really serious about this very expensive project?
Boeing has a habit of talking down the market when we are about to launch a program. So yes, we are very serious about doing this aircraft. It will be needed for the routes in the world which are very high traffic routes, and it is part of the effort to keep the cost of air travel falling.
Boeing didn't fly in the show, but this is the first of what they're calling the next generation, the 737-700 series. Building on success is the phrase. The company hopes this new version of the undoubtedly highly successful aircraft will help maintain Boeing as the biggest producer of jetliners. But one of the big talking points at the show was the company's proposed takeover of the plane maker McDonnell Douglas. The European Union is objecting, citing reduced competition, and Airbus is also trying to block the plan. But some people say it could work in Airbus's favour.
Airbus have an extremely competent, very technically advanced family of airliners. They have only one gap in their current range at the top end of the market. They seem to be the people who are determined to go ahead and fill that gap above the 747, where Boeing have decided not to. If Airbus actually play their cards right, without Douglas there, Airbus actually has a much better market opportunity than it had before. And I think they're crying wolf at the moment. moment, and I don't think it does them any good at all to be crying wolf.
Crying wolf or not, the landing of the smallest Airbus so far, the A319, rounds off a good air show for Airbus.
Sales of corporate jets are climbing away from recession, and here in Paris most of the interest has been at the top end of the market. The new Gulfstream 5 costs $30 million, which puts it out of the reach of most private owners. The main customers are large corporations who wish to transport executives and clients far and fast, and in the greatest of style. The sumptuous cabin accommodates up to 19 passengers on trips of 7,000 miles. It's faster than a 747, and though some claim you can't go that fast in busy airspace, its makers say it's seldom slowed by other traffic.
We have a very nice advantage with the Gulfstream in that we hold the records also for high altitude. And what we can do with the Gulfstream is go right away up to the 40,000 foot levels, which most airplanes, especially the airliners, aren't capable of doing. So we plan our flight plans on these flights to go 41,000 and above, and this airplane is capable of going all the way up to 51,000 feet. And that allows us to go up above the air traffic and go direct on legs, so we can take advantage of the high speed by going high and fast at the same time.
And here's the competition, the Global Express from Bombardier, also making its show debut. Still under test, it's due for certification next year. And it's even faster than the G5. The Global Express flew direct from Wichita to Paris in 8.5 hours, its longest flight to date. But for raw speed, this beats all the competition. The Cessna mid-size Citation 10 flies at just over Mach 0.9, making it the world's fastest passenger aircraft after Concorde.
It's really, as you can see, the design of the aircraft, the wing and the fairing on the aircraft were designed with the whole emphasis on giving the aircraft speed. And you can see that there are various, the area ruling on the aircraft, the wing design of the aeroplane are all there to emphasize the speed characteristics of the aircraft.
All the big names in corporate jets are here at Le Bourget. The Learjet 60 claimed a speed record from Pittsburgh to Paris, 8 hours and 1 minute, but that did include a fuel stop. Raytheon brought the popular Hawker 800 and took orders for its new Horizon, which has yet to fly. But the only bizjets which actually displayed were from Dassault of France. The Falcon 900 is distinguished by its 3-engine configuration. It's another transcontinental aircraft with a range of 5,000 nautical miles. The twin-engine Falcon 2000 has a larger payload, but a shorter range of around 3,500 miles. Both aircraft carry up to 19 passengers and cruise at up to Mach 0.87. And at little more than half the price of the G5 and Global Express, you might even say they're good value for money.
Now we go to the military jets. Eurofighter surprised us by having 2 aircraft in the flying display, the 2 latest development aircraft, DA6 and 7. 6 is Spanish, the first 2-seat version, and 7 is the last development aircraft, a single-seater built in Italy. Both aircraft are carrying some of their operational weapons load, well, dummies at least. On the wingtips, the self-defense chaff and flare dispensers and the electronic countermeasures pod, and under the wings, Sidewinder missiles. When Eurofighter gets into service, those will be replaced by the advanced short-range air-to-air missile ASRAAM. and under the fuselage, racks for the advanced medium-range missiles. Altogether, there's capacity for a mix of at least 10 missiles. For the strike and interdiction role, there's room for 7 weapons like smart bombs and their laser designators. And of course, extra fuel tanks can be carried as well. In plan form, you can see that that little canard wing is well ahead of the main delta. That means good manoeuvrability. These aircraft now have Eurojet EJ200 engines. Some earlier aircraft have Tornado engines, producing only about 3/4 of the thrust. And that's one reason why they're really beginning to explore the Eurofighter performance envelope.
Well, the aircraft's clear to Mach 2 now. We're operating up to 40,000 feet, using up to 25 degrees angle of attack, which perhaps as a comparison, when I was displaying at Farnborough last year, I was using a mixture of 15 and 20 depending on the speed I was flying at. So we see those things increasing all the time. We see a display here being flown with EJ200, the production standard of engine. Having said that, these are still interim engines, so they don't have the full potential that the final in-service aircraft will have. But it represents in the order of 25 to 50%, depending on whether you're in dry or reheat power, increase on what I had in the RB199.
The French are not, of course, involved in Eurofighter because they have their own Rafale. It's cheaper and simpler than Eurofighter, and Dassault offers Rafale as a replacement for current aircraft like Jaguar and Mirage. So it's a competitor. Incidentally, the word Rafale means a squall or a burst of machine gun fire. Comes in 3 versions. There's this heavily loaded 2-seater Rafale B for the French Air Force, the Armée de l'Air. There's also the M, which is a carrier-borne naval version. And then there's this Rafale C, which is a single-seater for the Air Force, complete with so-called smoke winders on the wingtips. Those are smoke generators that look like the sidewinder missiles that more usually sit on such wingtips. But this multi-role aircraft can carry much more than just short-range air-to-air missiles. It has up to 14 store points underneath, and it can carry more than 8 tons of such things as Mika and Apache missiles, and those fuel tanks we saw on the B model. Fly-by-wire systems account for the excellent agility. This is one of the aircraft Rafale will eventually replace. Aircraft of the Mirage 2000 family have been in service since the mid-80s. But the word is that the French Air Force will not readily relinquish this highly capable combat aircraft. This is the latest version, the 2005, and these violent manoeuvres demonstrate that although it's a single delta without a canard, the 2005 fly-by-wire control system is no slouch in the agility stakes. This particular aircraft is the B version, and that means it's the 2-seater. Like Rafale, it's an aircraft with several roles: air interception, surface attack over either land or sea, and reconnaissance. Now here's another 2-seater, the Sukhoi Su-32. But unlike the Mirage, and indeed unlike most other 2-seat fighters, this one has the seats side by side. One reason, say Sukhoi, is so that the 2 crew can see each other's cockpit combat displays. Whatever the reasons, it makes for a look not unlike the old American F-111s, although I do have to say the F-111 never looked as graceful as this. This development of the Su-27 fighter, with the obligatory canard wing, is a long-range, shore-based maritime strike aircraft. It's got an unrefueled range of more than 2,100 nautical miles, which takes it about 4.5 hours. So with in-flight refueling, it can go much further and for much longer. All of that suggests another reason for the cockpit layout, because in that hump behind the cockpit, they've actually got a small galley and a toilet.
It's demonstrated today by Igor Votsensev of Sukhoi.
Although the MiG-29 is roughly the same shape as the Sukhoi Su-27 and its derivatives, it's older and smaller, and it seems to have undergone rather less development than the Sukhois. And unlike them, it doesn't have fly-by-wire control systems, and it hasn't joined the Canard Club. Nonetheless, the MiG-29, this is the SE export version, the MiG-29's been a great success for the Russians. Even without fly-by-wire, it's very manoeuvrable, and it's also tough and rugged. It can operate from rough, semi-prepared airstrips, and its 2 big RD-33 engines have intake doors that close off on the ground to stop debris being sucked up into the engines. Well, we've looked at some Russian fighters, but what about the trainers that produce the pilots for them? Well, the Russians have got their own internal competition for new generation trainers between this MiG-AT and the brand new Yak 130. Both of them are joint efforts with West European companies. In Yakovlev's case, there's a consortium with Aermacchi of Italy and Považské Strojárny of Slovakia, which provides the two DV2S turbofan engines. The big sales target is the Russian Air Force, which needs to replace about 1,000 L-29 and L-39 trainers. But the new consortium building the Yak 130 reckons that there's a worldwide market of more than 1,300 advanced trainers like this over the next decade. And Aermacchi sees the 130 as completing its portfolio of training aircraft. The claim is that with its fly-by-wire system, the 130 handles like the Rafales and Eurofighters and the Sukhois and MiGs that'll be flown by its pilot trainees. The Russian Air Force has ordered 10 of each of these two aircraft before making its decision on which to buy in quantity. Aermacchi dismisses the competition from the MiG-AT, which it claims is an older design ordered by the Russians to help maintain their industrial base. But other Western European companies are involved with the MiG-AT, especially the French. The engines are Snecma Larzac turbofans, and much of the instrumentation is by Sextant Avionique, with other components subcontracted to Messier Hispano and Oxylec. So there is obviously faith in the future of MiG-AT amongst some of the hard-headed business groups of Western Europe. The MiG is slightly smaller and its cruising speed is 380 knots compared with the Yak's 450. But it has a landing speed 5 knots slower than the Yak's, which is an advantage in a trainer. Both MiG-AT and Yak 130 have LCD colour displays in their cockpits, and they both boast fly-by-wire control systems. But MiG is very keen to point out that their new system is reconfigurable. That's to say you can change the control characteristics to mimic the handling of a wide variety of frontline aircraft.
Мираж 2000, МиГ-29, Су-27 – это все легко.
It is the most easy to simulate the F-16, F-18, Mirage 2000 and MiG-29 and so on. It's very, very easy.
One thing the Russians don't seem to have learned from their Western collaborators is the art of presentation and finish. I wonder why it is that all Russian aircraft at shows seem to have tyres down to the canvas and somewhat less than perfect paint jobs.
After years of recession, the light plane makers are beginning to see an upturn in the market. In the late 1970s, Piper and Cessna were turning out piston aircraft in tens of thousands, but things got so bad that both companies stopped making singles altogether. Now both are back with updated versions of their former best-selling types. That's partly due to changes in the American product liability laws. The plane makers can no longer be sued over accidents in which the aircraft was more than 18 years old.
If you looked at before that legislation became active, we were liable for maybe 70,000 airplanes. When that legislation was enacted, that dropped to a much smaller number, maybe 20 or 30,000 airplanes. And every year that we get further along, we actually have fewer and fewer airplanes that we're liable for. So it certainly has helped us in that regard.
This is the best-selling light plane of all time. The four-place Cessna 172 Skyhawk is back in production, alongside its stablemate, the more powerful 182 Skylane. At first sight, both aircraft are little changed from the original versions, but there are improvements such as the updated instrument panel. What hasn't changed is the Lycoming engine. The basic design is now more than 40 years old.
Certainly, Lycoming is one of the leading manufacturers of aircraft engines, has been for years, and their research and development is looking very seriously at future power plants. I know that as long ago as 15 years, back in my previous days with Cessna was looking at alternate power plants and actually went as far as to install Porsche engine in a 182. So we're very cognizant of the technology that's available, and we're looking at our options. But right now we feel the Lycoming range of engines, the IO360 and the 172, the IO540 and the 182, it offers the best value and reliability for the customer.
Cessna and Piper are not alone. Almost all piston aircraft manufacturers use old technology like Lycoming and Continental engines. Mooney did once experiment with a Porsche power plant, but few were sold. But now an engine revolution could be underway. The French plane maker Carter has already made inroads into the American market with its popular Trinidad and Tobago singles. Both planes have Lycoming power plants. Now Carter is testing a brand new Renault engine, and it is indeed revolutionary. Not only does it use 30% less fuel, but it runs on jet fuel. In many parts of the world, that's half the price of avgas. But other car engine makers have failed in their attempts to break into aviation. Will Renault be any different?
The Porsche or some of the car engines were modified to make aircraft engines, and this can't work because the specifications of an engine for an aircraft are so different of the specification for a car. And on this engine Socata made a real specification of what we need for an aircraft, and this engine has been designed especially for the aircraft with the specification we needed. And only for that reason I am sure that this engine will be a very good product.
Now here's something rather odd for a high-tech, cutting-edge air show, with its vintage Wright Cyclone piston engines and its rather strange off-centre nose wheel. More about why the Urel Dubois HD34 is here in a moment, but notice how quickly it gets airborne. It lifts off at about 60 knots, less than half the takeoff speed of today's airliners. And here's the clue to how it performs like that. Look at that extraordinary wing. Not only that, but it's a sort of biplane, because that strut with the wheels on it also provides some lift. And here's the reason for its being here, emblazoned on the fuselage, the 50th anniversary of the distinguished French aviation company Urel Dubois. This aeroplane was built in 1957 to test the so-called high aspect ratio wings. It represented the culmination of Urel Dubois' whole aeroplane manufacture, and this is the only one left. Nowadays, the company is probably most famous for the variety of thrust reversers it makes for all sizes of aircraft, but it's also heavily involved in big structural assemblies for plane makers all round the world. So, a happy big 5-0 for Urel Dubois.
The Airbus A300, the first member of the Airbus family. In fact, this one was only the third to come off the production line. Now it's been converted for a special purpose, and it's here on show to potential customers. The aircraft is operated by the French company Nova Space to explore the phenomenon of zero gravity. Aerobatic pilots are familiar with the experience of plus or minus G. By diving on a pre-calculated parabola, the zero-G plane can cancel out the two forces to give its passengers a short period of weightlessness. It's used to train astronauts and to test equipment to be used in space. There are also many scientific experiments which can only be carried out in zero gravity. The cycle starts at 28,000 feet with the aircraft at 130 knots, close to the stall. As it dives steeply, its occupants go into free fall. They're accelerating at the same rate as the aircraft, but without the drag of airflow. At 20,000 feet, the crew must pull out of the dive. The fun lasts for just 25 seconds.
And we are limited by the maximum speed of the aircraft, which is on this aircraft 345 knots. And we go to enter the parabola at this speed, and it gives you a certain time of microgravity. We cannot have more time of microgravity, more length, if we cannot augment the speed.
The maneuver is not easy to perform. To maintain zero G, the dive must be flown very accurately. Locks on the controls restrict each yoke to a single axis. One pilot controls the aircraft in roll, the other in pitch. Surprisingly, the operators have not been able to program an autopilot to fly the 0G parabola. As the aircraft reaches its maximum speed, they pull out of the dive. The passengers fall back into the real world.
One aircraft who could give more microgravity than that is the Concorde aircraft. We make some calculation, and with the Concorde we can fly about 1 minute of micro-G, because the Concorde goes much faster than this aircraft, can entrance in the parabola much faster. But the size of the Concorde is smaller and it's not very useful for us, but it could be used for that.
One show visitor found this all very familiar. As the third man on the moon, he underwent 0G training back in the 1960s.
Well, there's an airplane over here on my left, which is an old 707. That's the type that we used when we did our 0G training. I believe we got slightly longer, and I think the reason was we could pull more Gs. We used 2.5 Gs in our pull-up and 2.5 Gs in our pull out of the maneuver. And I'm told here that they use 1.8 G for the pull-up, so they're not quite getting it up as far and then going over the top. They don't quite get maybe 5 seconds, but it's still 25 seconds is more than enough time for that type work that they're doing with it.
The first time you ever did it, is it what you expected?
Oh yeah, and you never forget it. It's great fun. And of course, people always ask me about going to the moon, and I tell them that was a great experience, but my experience in flying our first space station, Skylab, was such that it was as big or bigger inside than this airplane was, and I had 0G for 28 days.
And what was that like?
Fantastic.
Pete Conrad ending our report from Paris. He's a bit of a character, isn't he?
Well, yes, he is. And actually, of course, besides being a former astronaut, he's a very accomplished pilot. He still flies a lot at the age of 67. He's got his own Piper Chieftain, which he keeps out in California. And I believe he's broken a couple of round-the-world records. But he really is a guy to go around the Paris Air Show with, because he opens so many doors. Every chalet you go into, especially the American ones, they know who he is. They invite you in for a drink. They try and sell him an aeroplane, in fact.
Well, it's rather nice, though, isn't it, though, just to stand next to somebody who has stood on the moon.
Absolutely, and you feel with Pete, he could actually go up there and do it all again. Well, Paris may be the world's biggest event for the aerospace industry, but for sheer numbers of aircraft, you can't beat our next show. The difference is that they're small planes, and they're not sold to airlines or governments, they're sold to ordinary people. The Popular Flying Association's annual rally is the largest event of its kind outside America, and it's very different to any other British air show. The people who come to Cranfield are not content to look at planes, they want to fly them. The PFA is their organisation, and this is their showcase event. The best way to come is by air, and the show attracts almost 2,000 private aircraft, many of them built by their owners. At peak times, the approach gets very busy. Pilots are just advised to keep a good lookout and separate themselves. In the tower, all is relaxed. They have a system, and it seems to work.
I think we claim our record is 18 in 1 minute with 2 go-arounds on 2 runways, which is not bad, really. But this is fairly steady, so we've got a nice spread. They're all sorting themselves out into a reasonable distance apart. And you have to bear in mind that looking from here, you get a slightly false impression because there's 2 parallel approaches, and whereas those 2 aircraft might look as if they're extremely adjacent, they've actually got about 150 metres horizontally between them on 2 separate runways.
The PFA is especially helpful to home builders. With new factory aircraft unaffordable to many flyers, there's been a big move towards kits. And this is currently the most successful. The Europa is built entirely of composites. It has good performance and is full of good ideas. This landing gear retracts with bungee cords. New this year is a nose-wheel version, though somehow it doesn't have quite the same clean lines as the tail dragger.
We haven't really pushed the tri-gear yet, and I think it'll appeal to a different market.
but certainly the most popular by far has been the monowheel, for all the things that it gives. Less weight, less complexity, less cost, and better performance, really.
Europa kits have been sold in 26 countries. More than 400 aircraft are currently under construction. They're taking to the skies at 2 a week. Just about everything about this aircraft is good, and it's relatively cheap. The basic kit costs around £15,000, and with engine and instruments you could get airborne for around twice that. No special skills are needed. Some aircraft have been built in less than 1,000 hours, and there's now an even quicker option.
People are really wanting a one-year project. They want to come to the PFA rally here this year and be on the flight line with their Europa next year. And to that end, we've actually brought out a new Mark II Europa, which is a really fast-built kit with many of the parts not only pre-moulded but actually pre-assembled, bringing it as close as we can to the CAA's 500 hours labour for home-built aircraft.
A new aircraft at this year's rally was the Jabiru from Australia. It's named after a stork. The makers are now hoping to break into the European market, and it's the engine which has had the most attention.
The Jabiru airframe was designed in 1989 and it initially used an Italian engine, but after they got the aircraft type certified as a factory production machine and built 28 aeroplanes, the engine manufacturer went out of business. So they looked around the market for a new engine and they couldn't find one that was suitable, so they decided to start from scratch and design their own engine and manufacture their own engine in Australia. And that's the Jabiru, initially the 1600 60 horsepower, and in the recent years the 2200 80 horsepower engine. So it's one of the few aircraft in recent years that's had an engine and airframe designed by the same designers. That means that the weight and balance of the aircraft, the power to weight ratio, is absolutely optimised. Because the engine was designed by aircraft designers, they realised how important it was to keep weight to a minimum. So the engine is dimensionally small and tight for drag purposes and for weight purposes as well. So it makes for a very nicely harmonised aeroplane and engine combination.
Well, for home builders who don't fancy any of the kits on offer, there's always the option of designing your own aircraft from scratch. That's what Barry Plum did. Like many home builders, he started out as an aero modeller. But building a full-size aircraft was a much bigger challenge. Such projects are not for the faint-hearted. Many people lose interest along the way. The Plum biplane took 3 years on the drawing board and a further 8 years in the garage.
It's a long process and you need to put in a fair amount of commitment, and once you've actually got that all realised and the last hurdles are over, you've got the piece of paper in your hand which allows you to go and fly the aeroplane. That is a wonderful feeling, it really is. Marvellous. The construction standards to which home-built aeroplanes are put together is exactly the same as those for factory-built aeroplanes. We have to work within the same airworthiness requirements that the manufacturers do. The PFA have a number of inspectors who are appointed via the organisation to go and look at all of the home-built aeroplanes and sign them off at various stages through their construction. There's about 14 or 15 stages that have to be signed off through the construction. And the inspectors, who are usually people that work within the aircraft industry, know exactly what is and what isn't allowed and what standards the constructor has to work to. And believe me, if you have a look at most home-built aeroplanes, they're actually produced to much higher standards than anybody could afford to produce them in a factory.
The unique Plum biplane. Well, at this show, the flying display is almost incidental, but here's a little aircraft that's been delighting the crowds for years. The Turbulent team has had a long association with the famous Tiger Club, for many years based at Redhill, now at Headcorn in Kent. The aircraft is the work of the brilliant French designer Roger Drouin. Around 30 were made under licence by Rollisons in this country. Many more were produced by home builders. The Turbulent is a source of many flying stories. The editor of Pilot magazine, James Gilbert, describes how he once broke off half a prop blade while landing on a remote Orkney island. With no help to hand, he found a sharp knife and managed to cut off half the other blade. He then took off and flew home. The Turbulent is that kind of aircraft. turbulence still display all over Europe. Flower bombing and balloon bursting are usually part of the fun. Now here's something rather more powerful. The Yak-50 is powered by a 360 horsepower Ivchenko radial engine, and for an aircraft of this size, that means sparkling performance. The Yak-50 is an example of the many East European aircraft now finding their way onto the British Airshow circuit. This one came from Lithuania. Here comes a tail slide, and you don't often see it from this angle. The Yak is sponsored by Flyer magazine and flown by John Griffin. In some of these manoeuvres he pulls as much as 9G, and considering he doesn't wear a G suit, that's a lot. You couldn't do it for more than a few seconds without blacking out. Well, the Yak-50 has won the World Aerobatic Championship in its time. It's now been overtaken by more modern types like the Caps and Sukhois, but just look at the rate of roll. It's still a very sprightly machine, even by modern standards. Well, staying with the Yak stable, this is the 18T. The original Yak-18 was a military trainer. This is a tourer, but it's also fully aerobatic, and that's very unusual for a four-seater. The Russians built more than 1,000 18Ts, and they're now beginning to find their way into Britain. And just listen to the sound of that big radial engine. Well, the big advantage of East European aircraft is that they're cheap, and the arrival here of so many new types over the last few years is becoming a great concern to Western plane makers. The Finnist has a vague resemblance to some Cessnas. It also has a strong connection with the Yak-18T we've just been looking at.
The company's name is Technoavia. The guy that runs it is a designer from the Sequoia Bureau. He decided to go it alone, and his primary aeroplane that he was involved in was the Yak-18T. He builds that aeroplane, and with the money that he makes with that, he's decided to design his own aircraft, and this is the fourth example of that aeroplane. It's a bush aeroplane. South America, Africa, Australia, outback, that sort of thing. It's a very versatile aeroplane. It carries a heavy load. It's a very short field aeroplane, and it's very simple and docile to fly. And obviously for an aeroplane that's going to be in the field, away from civilization for lengthy periods, it's designed to be almost maintenance-free.
This aircraft could be bought either as a kit or ready built. Of course, there's a difference in the price, but even the factory-made version isn't expensive compared to some rivals. A fully certified Sky Arrow costs £55,000. It's aimed at the training market, and with a cruising speed of 110 knots, it's slightly faster than the familiar Cessna 152. The Sky Arrow has a four-cylinder Rotax engine with a pusher propeller. Its Italian makers say it has half the operating costs of the Cessna, but its small cabin and rather flimsy appearance may limit its appeal.
Somebody would buy an aircraft like this who enjoys the tandem seating, enjoys the visibility, enjoys the safety, security, and the reliability.
Well, certainly the training market is crying out for cheaper flying. Will the Sky Arrow fit the bill? For owner pilots on a limited budget, the Jodel with its distinctive cranked wings is a popular choice. There are many different marks, all of them efficient and reliable.
My Jodel, I bought it 6 years ago in Germany, and that was after searching in America for a Cessna or a Champion. And then I started looking at an aircraft that was giving me some traveling speed, around 100 knots, but also the capability of taking my wife, Marion, and some luggage to go on holiday. and so we came on to a Jodel. It's a fabulous aircraft. Haven't seen any better. I'm still looking for it, but I haven't found it.
The Jodel design originates from France, and it's easy to see its connection with the more modern Robin aircraft. But many examples like this D-18 are home-built. The owner reckons the aircraft costs just £20 an hour to fly. The two-seater Jodels are among many small types which can be maintained on a permit to fly rather than a full certificate of airworthiness. That allows the owner to carry out the maintenance work himself instead of paying a licensed engineer.
One of the interesting things about the D-18 is that you can do your own thing in the engine installations, because the plans just show you a drawing of an engine mount for a Volkswagen engine. They say fit a Volkswagen engine. In our case, this engine came out of a combi van originally, Volkswagen combi van, and when we've got the Barry Smith's heads on it and things, we fitted it onto the aircraft, but we used the alternative and natural thinking way of doing things in order to save money apart from anything else. And so we put a Peugeot fuel pump on it. We used micro-bore central heating pipe for the fuel lines, two Fiesta distributors with two tooth timing belts off the back of the engine. We also fitted the starter ring on the back of the engine and the starter motor. The starter motor came off Subaru, and the alternator direct drives off the same shaft, which came out of a 2CV. So the wheel brakes actually came off a Honda 90 motorbike, and the cables are lawnmower throttle cable, which is the right diameter, but the outer of the cables are actually BMX push bike outer, so if you can get it long enough, you get right up and into the aircraft.
Another home-built Jodel here, and the registration gives a clue to what the builder had in mind. These aircraft are highly capable tourers, and those strictly VFR machines, many have been all over Europe. When hourly costs are low, there's a great incentive to go places.
I chose it because I didn't want to spend a lot of money on a traditional aircraft engine, which is very old-fashioned technology and extremely expensive and inefficient. This one is virtually the only two-seater which has a very good performance on a converted Volkswagen engine. It's actually a German certificated motor glider engine, and even new, they're really much less money than a reconditioned traditional aircraft engine. And also much cheaper to operate. I can fly this for £9 an hour and go over 100 miles. So I can fly it a lot without worrying about the cost of flying it. Once you've insured it and paid for the hangar bills, the fuel is more or less incidental. And I knew that if I built an airplane, I would fly it all the time, and I didn't want that to damage the family budget. Last year when I came to the rally from Leicester, I went across the continent, through Belgium, Denmark, across Sweden, into Norway, and up to North Cape, which is actually just inside the Arctic Circle, and then back in reverse, which took, from memory, I think it was 7 or 8 days, and it was something like 5,000 miles.
Well, back to the displays now, and this is the Laser Z200. It's a single-seater and it's cleared for unlimited aerobatics, and that means it's very, very strong. Laser Z is based on the Stevens Acro of 20 years ago. No kit plane this, you have to make it yourself, all from plans. It's got a fuselage of welded steel tube, and with this kind of stress on the airframe, you better get that welding right. The single-piece wing is made of wood and has a symmetrical section, which means the laser flies equally well either way up. And it can make a 360-degree roll in just 1 second. Well, our last display at Cranfield comes from a couple of seasoned performers. The Rover team is led by Brian Lacombe, one of the great characters of the airshow circuit. Besides having more than 5,000 hours of actual display time, he's well known for his articles in flying magazines, and he's also written several novels. His partner in this year's Extra 300 team is John Taylor. The Extra 300 is another very strong aeroplane. It's stressed to plus or minus 25 G. That means overstressing the airframe is not a consideration. Coming up here is a very difficult manoeuvre, the mirror loop. Brian is pushing negative G on the inside, John pulling positive. The team were booked to do 90 displays this year, which is their last season under their present contract with Rover. The word is they've got a new sponsor next year. We're still waiting to find out who that is. Rover pair in their Extra 300s. Well, now the rush to get home, but for many there's no hurry to leave this huge gathering of private pilots. In days when flying seems to be getting more and more regulated, it's good that the PFA is out to protect the interests of recreational pilots. This is a good event and well worth a visit, however you come. You can be sure that most of them will be back next year.